Welcome to Clear Conversations, Entrepreneurial Legacies with your host, John Sleeting, an executive partner for Clearwater Capital Partners. Join John and his guests on this exclusive journey behind the scenes of extraordinary entrepreneurial families. In this series, we will dive deep into the stories of John's guests, who generously unveil the paths they've walked, the challenges they've overcome, and the wisdom they've gained along the way. Throughout these conversations, we explore their achievements beyond mere recognition, disclosing the distinctive perspectives that have shaped their entrepreneurial journeys. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to Clear Conversations, the Entrepreneurial Legacies series. I'm John Sleeting, your host, and today I'm joined by Tricia Osolin. Tricia is the CEO and founder of Redmark. It's a boutique consulting firm that she will share more about. She's got a great history from her time in Hollywood to coming to Chicago, doing her MBA, and founding her business. She will take you through a story, which is a story narrative that she applies to her life, the people that she serves, the engagement she works on, and how we all should be thinking about our legacy. How we should be thinking about the destination of what book and what story we're writing regarding all the decisions we make and the actions we take on a daily basis to impact the world around us and hopefully make it better. I'm excited for you because I've been so encouraged and challenged in my own thought process since I first met Tricia. So I look forward to you engaging in this conversation as well. Tricia, thank you so much for being here today, and I look forward to diving in many different ways. Your own entrepreneurial journey, how you think about legacy, but also the insight regarding your life's experiences, how you bring those together that actually create a framework for others to be thinking about their own life story that they're writing through story theory, narrative, and we're going to dive into all of those things as we go. Yeah. But to go ahead and start, currently today, right, you are the founder and CEO of Redmark.
Yes.
Tell our listeners a little bit about Redmark, and then we're going to back up in time.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm excited to be here and to chat further with you. Redmark, we are a growth consulting agency, a boutique growth consulting agency. And what does that mean? We focus on top line growth. So that's a lot of marketing, messaging, really looking at how an organization can connect with their audience in order to tell their story from an audience perspective. And we find that this helps organizations grow authentically because they're more authentically connecting with their audience and feeding that top line growth. That's what we love and what Redmark's all about.
And so I want to take your own entrepreneurial journey, and before we rewind to this concept of legacy and how you define legacy, and then we'll back up.
Yeah. So I mentioned with Redmark that we utilize story or have organizations tell their story. And that's probably feeds how I view legacy, how I, Tricia, view legacy, because I see a lot through a narrative framework. And so I really think of legacy as what narrative, what story are you building your life into? And how will that live on past your time here on this earth? So really through the lens of narrative or stories, probably also how I view a human's legacy.
Right. So we're going to rewind a little bit then.
Okay.
So you grew up in Ohio,
right?
You went to Miami of Ohio, right? Not Miami of Florida, Miami of Ohio University. So all in Ohio growing up, and then you decided to go to the West Coast.
I did.
So what brought you out to California? And then we'll talk a little bit about what you were doing out there.
Yeah, I moved to Los Angeles right after undergrad and originally was only going to stay there a few weeks and then stayed there about a decade. So that's what LA will do to you in your 20s. And it's probably a lot of the foundation of this story. I mean, growing up, we watched lots of Disney, so that's getting story narrative in your head. But I worked in Hollywood while I was in LA, in movies and television, and we did a lot of work looking into story theory and how to present a film or a movie to an audience during the marketing and production side of the movie. So how to sell the movie, how to tell people to come watch the movie. So there's probably the professional excuse me, probably the professional origin of this narrative obsession of mine. And it was a wonderful 10 years of sunshine and scripts.
What fascinated me, so you studied entrepreneurship both for undergrad. Later, after you moved from California to Chicago, you went to the Chicago Booth School and did your MBA there. Again, focused in entrepreneurism.
Yeah.
So the storyline and the work that you did in Hollywood, coming together with being an entrepreneur yourself and studying entrepreneurism, and the combination of those really, in my mind, strikes at the core of this. Well, what is an entrepreneurial legacy, right? Because the legacy component comes at the end of the story. And so people have to be conscious of writing their own story on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So help our listeners understand, and we'll start unpacking this. What is meant by story theory?
Yeah. So can I say one thing on entrepreneurship first?
Sure.
I think entrepreneurship, or I've even seen it take a little bit of a new life in the past 10, 20 years. And I think originally you asked me, did I grow up knowing I wanted to be an entrepreneur? And I said no, because we didn't use the language of entrepreneurship. And then I remembered, I started a female detective agency when I was in grade school, and I started a babysitter club when I was in grade school. And now, looking back, we call that entrepreneurship. I was a little entrepreneur. But I didn't call it that then. We're just making things, thinking of things. And I think that's really entrepreneurship, like what we have now called entrepreneurship. I believe we were made by the creator of the universe, and we were made in his image, and we're all mini creators. So entrepreneurship can be seen as what we are creating during our time on Earth. So much of it in my life now revolves around story theory and my company, Redmark. But my entrepreneurship happens to be focused into a business.
Yeah.
But entrepreneurship could be in many venues.
Yeah.
So I think everyone's a mini creator / entrepreneur.
Yeah.
To segue back into story theory, which is really at the foundation of a lot of the work within Redmark. But story theory, Redmark, Tricia did not create. Story theory is a concept, and it's really the structure of a narrative, or how do you look at a narrative arc? If you heard of a hero's journey, that's based in story theory. If you've heard of a narrative arc, that's based in story theory. So it's taking something more qualitative and fuzzy, if you will, like a story, and kind of the science behind the story, the theory of why a story is the best way to connect with another human or an audience.
And so there's different points within story theory, if I understand correctly, and how you think about the structure of putting a story together.
Yes.
What are some of those points, and how do you think about starting to structure that to take it from theory and bringing it down to a little bit of practical?
Yes, there's many segments within story theory, but at Redmark, we use a 5-point system that builds on a story, uses story theory to build a narrative arc. So the 5 points are: point 1, every story would have a character, a main character, your hero, if you will.
Okay.
Point 2, that hero finds a challenge, a problem, a deep issue that they need to solve. Point 3, they come across a guide. This guide could be an individual, a concept, something that is going to help them solve this problem. Step 4 is a plan. The guide introduces them to a plan or reveals some steps in the road to solve this issue. And step 5 is the resolution. Something happens at the end, a success or a failure in their conquest of achieving or rectifying this challenge. Okay. So those would be the 5 points in a narrative story arc based in story theory. And in story theory, individuals have mapped out, every Academy Award-winning movie into these 5 points.
Okay.
Or many stories, Disney stories, can be mapped into these 5 points. So you see a structure, a basic framework within a narrative arc.
Right. And so you go see a movie, whether it's 2 to 3 hours or whatever, you watch that movie of the characters and following those arcs. And then this is where I even step back from our discussion to reflect on it, saying, but I'm writing my own story, right? And everyone is writing their own story. So when I step back thinking, am I the hero or am I the challenge? Right. And then who is my guide through that? And do I have a plan? And then the resolution. And in that resolution, would you liken that resolution piece to also being the legacy component of saying, well, here's how the story comes together in the end, to actually take all the disparate parts and all the circumstances that have happened, and you're bringing it together.
I would hope for my legacy, my story, that all the parts would be visible, not only the resolution.
Okay.
A lot of times people focus only on the resolution, on the success or the failure of that story arc. And I think what connects people is really seeing the entirety of the story, knowing that individual, that character hero,
Right.
understanding and connecting with their challenge. I don't care about your resolution, Tricia, unless I know what you went through.
Right.
So I would hope that, throughout my life, I'll have many challenges. And I would hope that my legacy or the narrative left behind includes some of that challenge, and then what that plan and what that guide led me through. So I wouldn't mind if all the pieces were visible.
Yeah. And so when you think about the guide, right? Who is the guide? So for everyone out, is that mentors? Is that bosses? Is that spouses? Is that what is the guide typically? Is that an organization?
So it's not always definite. I don't think everyone has one story arc throughout their life, first of all, or one guide throughout their life. You could have many guides in your life. I am a Christian, so my guide for my life through Christian doctrine, my guide is set up as a singular guide of Jesus Christ. So it's almost very succinct for me.
Yeah.
Certainly, there are times where I maybe take secondary guides, and hopefully that the guide I'm looking to is also being guided by my primary guide.
Right.
If this is flowing. But certainly people who don't follow that faith also have guides, whether they're conscious or not. We could be guided by a family values. We could be guided by trends in the media. That's not necessarily bad if you are watching what's happening. Many organizations can be guided by the market. What is the market saying we need to do? So looking at guide a bit broader than just a singular person or entity or divinity in my case, to a bit more conceptually, a guide can open up into many things for different people.
Yeah. And so that's the guide. And this again, where I'm asking myself questions as I bounce them off you.
Yeah.
Am I the hero or am I the challenge?
Yeah.
Right. And am I the challenge that's looking for a hero that is actually then supported by guiding principles in my quest for whatever that may be?
So in individual lives differs from our working with organizations and where they should be.
Okay.
Many times organizations, as they're telling their story, will put themselves as the hero. This is not the right place for an organization to be in their story.
And when you say that, what do you mean by the organization puts themselves in as the hero?
They talk, when they tell their story, they talk about themselves. They might say, they might talk about an initial meeting might be about their founding or what they really care about or what they're trying to do. And they tell you all about themselves as their first introduction to you.
We're your hero. You're lucky you found us.
Here we are. Like the best example of this, or the case study that is popular, is Steve Jobs when he was at Apple and released the Lisa computer. And to do this, which was the best home computer at the time. I can't recall the year, possibly the 80s. And to release this, he put out an 8-page spread in the Wall Street Journal that usually I have a visual, but it's full of text about why this is the best computer, why everyone should love this computer, the RAM, the bunch of acronyms that I don't know. And the Lisa flopped. Not solely based on this, but Steve Jobs left Apple, worked at Pixar, and Pixar is a master storyteller.
Yeah.
So I don't know that they use a narrative story arc or story theory, but I'd assume that they are seeped in its relevancy. And when Steve Jobs came back to Apple after that, his advertising
completely changed.
It's much more visual. They had the tagline of "Think Different," and their next campaign showed Thomas Edison or icons, just singular icons, and said "Think Different." And it was much more conceptual and spoke to an audience. And what that does, the first one, where it was an 8-page ad about why the lease is awesome,
right,
was him being the hero. The next campaign, when he came back, was him saying his audience is the hero, challenging them to think differently, and putting Apple as that third spot, the guide. All of a sudden, Apple became the guide to help them think differently. And that would be a good example of story theory in play, or in advertising specifically, of how an organization could put themselves as the hero versus themselves as the guide.
See, that's where I paused even in our prior conversations, and it was like, okay, wait a second, right? Because how often do we all want to talk about ourselves? And here's all the great things we're doing. And what does that look like in that hero type role versus the result, which would be here's the life change that's happening for the people that the organization can come alongside. Because ultimately, and even within Clearwater Capital, we speak of the fact that we're in the business of life change, value creation, right? Yeah, there's the financial part of it and how they're thinking about their legacy development and their lifetime needs and reducing concern and reducing risk and how they manage all of that. But it's about the life change for the individual, because they should be the hero. And then we should be in that guide role, working on the fourth part, if I understand correctly, which is the plan. Well, what is the plan? Estate planning documents, financial planning, how does all this work together to achieve whatever the objectives are of the hero in that case, as they're writing this story, which then in some way gets unresolved or does get resolved or creates some form of a legacy every day. So when you step back, or when I stepped back and thinking about it, I just kept thinking about, is my life a movie that people would want to watch? Right? Or is it a sleeper movie? Is it a movie somebody would want to walk out on? Right? I mean, hopefully that's not the case. But just taking this construct and saying that's true for organizations, whether it be Apple or Clearwater or Redmark, it's true for individuals though too, in terms of the own story that we're writing. But you said there's a difference between organizations and at the individual human level. What would that difference be?
Yeah, I think that individually, you hear a lot of talk today about finding your why. Simon Sinek has the most viewed TED Talk on find your why. There's a lot of talk about the why. Probably within clear conversations, you have an audience, and if you're the guide, to help them pursue their why. Within our own lives, I think that why, and looking at the why, lives in that second spot of the challenge. What are we trying to do? So in our own lives, we're allowed to look at our personal whys. That's what makes up the challenge in our lives. What's our motivation? What are we trying to achieve? As an organization, you don't necessarily want to only be looking at the organization's whys. In story theory would posit that you should look at your audience's whys. What is meaningful to your audience, to your customers, to your donor base, to your volunteers, to whoever you're looking to communicate to. What is important to them? And how is your organization relevant in that way? For our own lives, we can be looking at ourselves and asking, what is our why and what is our challenge that we're looking to overcome? So I'd say you allow a little more self-indulgence in the individual life, and than in an organizational structure or story narrative.
So projects you're working on, right? Because here we are sitting in the Midwest, right? Versus everybody has their image of Hollywood and everything that entails from around the world. Everybody has a view on what comes out of Hollywood. You probably had some very interesting experiences, some that you can share, some that you can't. But for the listener, what were some of the experiences you had out there, interactions with people, projects that you worked on, that gives a little bit of that inside baseball talk regarding what you had done out there.
Yeah, so we worked in movies and television, I mentioned. So we'd get a movie script, and my company, BLT and Associates, was in charge of making a movie poster, making movie trailers, perhaps copy lines for what the movie would be about, and really how they would sell that movie to an audience. So my favorite things probably to work on would be retitling the movie, or making different movie posters for different audiences. Or, for example, if a film was a success, let's say in a niche market at a film festival,
Mm-hmm.
it probably had a movie poster that it was released at a film festival for. Then perhaps we're going to give it a theatrical release in the movie theaters. And you had to change the entire movie poster for the mass market in the movie theaters because it's now reaching a broader audience. So maybe you would, if it had any well-known individuals, they call it the floating heads, you'd make the movie poster with the floating heads. Perhaps if it was, the scenery was beautiful, you'd put some epic landscaping at the bottom to elevate that aspect of the film. So you'd need to tap into a different audience for what the individual poster was going to be, and all the aspects of the story itself.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting also from the story aspect, and who is our audience? Who are we looking to reach? And what should we be communicating about our product or the film to reach that audience? So that was some of the actual tactical things that the organization that I was doing while I was there.
And from a business school, non-story theory aspect, a lot of people talk about, well, that's client segmentation or customer segmentation, right? And understanding the different whys and how you still look at everyone's an individual, yet there are certain affinities between individuals that have commonality that you'd say, then we're serving this kind of an individual. And sometimes it feels like, well, now we're putting people in a box.
Yeah.
But there are also similarities, right? As people, we have way more in common than we don't, but we still argue and fight and go to wars over things. But there's so much that's in common. And yet how you approach that, everyone has a unique why. And you also want to be speaking to a select audience. And as you said, the mass market or the broader segment that's there is going to be different than maybe the critical segment or the film festival segment,
right?
And how they're approaching things
and what they're wanting from the film experience. Exactly. Yes.
And where do you think businesses in their marketing communications actually fall down on this subject? Right. Mm-hmm. Your example with Lisa and the computer, that's a good example, right? It just disconnected and wasn't reaching people. Yes. That had to change. So where do you see business schools change the way that they actually teach what marketing is?
So let's focus first on businesses and what they're, because that's what's coming up for me first. Okay. We could probably have another discussion on business schools and how they're doing this, but within businesses, especially in segmenting the market. So that's interesting. A lot of businesses are looking, who's our audience and how do we help organizations build personas around their audiences. And maybe a lot of organizations may have personas built, and it's interesting in how you talk about your personas. So a standard way to talk about, one of our target audiences might be millennial men who live in the city. And those are really demographic centered segments.
Okay.
What we would love to do from a story perspective is move into why-based personas. We like to name our personas. If you've seen this, where people say like donor Donna, or my persona is millennial Michael. This is fine. But what we'd love to call him is maybe missing meaning Michael. It's his why. You want to name them and know your personas based on their why, not just on their demographics. And the reason for this is because it helps you connect with them. It gives you their actual personal challenge, that number 2, and helps you not just put them in a box. When an organization is talking to an audience, you want to talk to people.
Yeah.
What millennial Michael might help you do. It's good for a business plan, but it's not good for building trust. It's not good for speaking to an individual, because millennial Michael, you don't know anything about him. But when you can name him and give me his why, I can envision more of his life. So I have more success in speaking to what he might be needing.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we love to help organizations do is look at the why for their consumer base, the why for their audience, and flipping their understanding of their segments from demographic centered personas to why centered personas, which feeds into, everything I'm saying, feeds into story, feeds into our
my
story
mind is
theory.
going 100 miles an hour. Right now.
I'm not meaning to harp on the same points, but they say when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if we're living a story, everything can fit into that story.
Yeah, but I think it's such a helpful construct to work through and bring that back. There's a book called Strangers in Paradise, and it uses a metaphor of immigration into wealth. Really, really high level is that 20% of the ultra wealthy, we define broadly as 30 million and above in terms of total net assets, 20% is old money and 80% turns over, right? Gets diluted away, gets inherited, right? One family might have X, but then with 4 or 5 kids, that gets, cut down to them and then down through the generations. And typically you end up having this turnover that takes place with that 80% of the ultra wealthy. So most of the time, the ultra wealth is all new money, right? So we talk about new money, old money. There's fewer cases of old money and a lot of cases of new money. And yet this metaphor from the book, Strangers in Paradise, uses it saying, well, if you immigrated from, pick a country, and came to the US as another country, you may not, as a first generation, you may not understand the language. You might not understand the norms. You might not understand a whole lot of the basics of what we take for granted of life because we've all grown up here, right? We're technically the old money living here because we understand it. Even when you went to California, you were looked at as going, okay, well, you're from the central part of the United States. You think differently than the way we think in California, right? If I not put words in your mouth, correct. So that's the way we grow up with this. And yet, if you look at an immigrant family, it's different because the first generation that immigrated doesn't understand. And from a wealth construct, it ends up being they don't understand. What am I supposed to do? How can I go buy a house that's X size? How much should I be giving? Is that taboo? And I only need to rely on my roots and my upbringing. I'm not allowed to join the club and do all these different things. And so they need the guide because now their challenges, they've come to a new country, call it wealth. They need a guide to come alongside them to help navigate the thought process and how they're not ruining the kids with the money, how they're not. And then with the second or the third generation, how do they protect against the trust fund kids that are just living off their trust funds versus being productive members of society? And also, having their own challenge, being their own first generation and what that means. So as you're going through all of this, right, and thinking through, okay, am I focused on the whys of those individuals? End up working with a lot of people that are that stranger in paradise, first generation entrepreneurial wealth creation, and they're trying to figure all of these things out because they're really successful in what they built in their own entrepreneurial journey. But then once they start understanding the structure, the norms, they start focusing more on that legacy piece and the resolution and going, where is all this going? So as you take that construct and that point, how does resolution actually even come to play, right? Is that a part of during someone's life or is that only resolved upon someone's passing at that point in time? How do you think about that whole segment of what resolution even is?
That's a great question. What resolution is? I would say for the beginning of it, and we'll get to what resolution is, you gave a beautiful example of why-based personas there, because a demographic-based persona might be new money, old money. But when you gave the perspective and linking it to immigration or linking it into a first generation of this, and you started detailing out some of the challenges that come out with that, their concerns about how the money will affect later generations, things like this. You can start to feel those more. When you say new money, old money, I kind of know, but I don't see the humanity behind it. But when you get into how you extrapolated on those concepts, I can envision those challenges, which is necessary for you as the guide to serve them well.
Right.
So I think that's a beautiful example of that.
Well, thank you. That's it's very affirming too.
A+
I appreciate it.
for guide-dom. Moving to the fifth step of this in the resolution for an individual life, there's probably multiple stories happening throughout your life. You could have a mini narrative. I mean, now on TikTok, people show mini narratives all the time. So they have got multiple little narratives every day of the week. But I'd say a meta narrative of your life, probably the resolution is based on your worldview in what happens after death. So I would say that the resolution of my life is a life well lived with my guide at the forefront, and where I go in the afterlife is probably my resolution, though I don't have this written down. So I could be moved from that as my end example. So I think probably resolution on the life side is, what is the point of your life? Which is an huge esoteric question that people probably struggle with in this legacy. And if I under a Christian doctrine, if I believe the relevance or the point of my life is to know God and make him known, then that is what lies in my resolution. And possibly a cause for a lot of challenge in people's lives is not knowing what the resolution and what's the point of life. Why are we here? This is a esoteric, a existential question. Why can't I say that word?
I won't try it either.
A big question that people struggle with their whole lives. So I would say a very non-answer to the question would be, that's a great question. What is our resolution?
And it really is fascinating to have a front row seat with individuals as they're trying to figure out, especially from this money thing. I think there's a lot of people that talk about a lot of different subjects before they talk about their financial well-being, whether it be out of shame, embarrassment. They don't think that they have enough in the world's eyes, even if they're in the fraction of the top 1% of people. They still don't think that they have enough, and they don't measure up in that way because they're using the wrong measuring stick. And also that aspect of individuals that haven't dealt with their mortality. Right. It's really interesting when you start going through and talking about, well, what does the estate plan look like? What does it mean when you pass away and you survive, or you both pass away, and what are you doing with the kids and grandkids? And everyone's like, well, I don't want to ruin them by telling them what we have now. But it's like, but if a tragic car accident happens, one, you're not ready for that yourself in terms of if you haven't dealt with your own mortality, and two, you haven't prepared the next generation, because all of a sudden this is going to be sprung on them anyway. And if there's things that aren't said or need to be resolved in relational aspects, it just goes undone. So individuals that haven't answered that question, because I think that's there's a life journey to that, to form that worldview that comes into place. But having that definitive worldview is dealing with your own mortality, because life is short, and everyone knows it intellectually. But when you sit down and you bring the attorneys around the table and the accountants, and our role as the wealth manager back with the families to sit down and navigate that, it's actually really interesting to see how many people really haven't dealt with their own mortality. So they can't deal with how I actually put this into paper for future generations.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. There is no resolution in that. So it is coming back to that question to encourage everyone, right? Dealing with are you clear on your worldview, and that worldview is the right worldview for you, and continuing to encourage people on that journey so that there is resolution during your lifetime with other relationships, with other kids, whatever it is that you're passing on. That's a huge aspect of this life experience, this human experience that we're all on, I think.
Yeah. It's leading me to a raw thought, which could be scary. Let's
go there.
Go there for a second. You've heard of in metrics, so oftentimes for organizations, how we talk about the resolution is their metrics. What are you measuring? What are you showing through your numbers? So in the land of story, we do care about quantitative elements. It just doesn't land in the first spot. But in speaking of metrics, there's leading metrics and lagging metrics. Okay, so some metrics that happen before what you want to happen and some that show what happened. I'm wondering when we talk about resolution, if some narrative arcs are leading narrative arcs and some are lagging, meaning in our own lives, oftentimes we have a felt need that could be a little mini narrative arc. Tricia, I am lonely. I need my challenge. I'm lonely. And then I find something, a guide that shows me how to make connections. And then I have a small narrative arc from there. What you're speaking of is a meta narrative arc that perhaps should be built the other way. What do we want the resolution to be? Mm-hmm. And then what's the path? And then who should we look to guide us on that path? And then why do we care? Our why becomes, why do I care about that end arc? So you can build that narrative arc from a personal standpoint from either direction, and it could become a different story.
Right. And so what I love about that is it does, in my mind at least, maybe nobody else's, get to the point of you don't write your legacy in the end. You're writing your legacy every day. So what do you want that to be? When you end the movie of your life, what are people going to say about it when they're walking out?
Which, is I like this because I find when people ask me, what's your why? It's an important question, and it's also such a big question. I ask people this all the time, and I find it very challenging to answer a why. But perhaps by looking at what do you want at the end would be a way to help us move back in discovering our why.
Right.
So we need Simon Sinek here to say, should we start with the why?
Right.
I think we should, but
way smarter than me, and
someone tag him.
Yeah, exactly, and we'll get him in here, right? So if I could get Simon Sinek into this conversation with us too, to go through that, because it's starting with the why, but the why also has to be answered with, well, where are you going?
Yes.
Right. If we're flying out of Chicago, are we going to New York or are we going to LA?
Because this tyranny of small decisions could have you focused on the wrong why all day, every day in little whys that aren't meaningful to your end legacy,
to the end game. Yeah. Of what you want that to be. And, and even when people say, there's a lot, you step back and say, well, my legacy is, I want to see it reflected in my kids, right? Or I want to see it reflected in this institution. I want to see it reflected in these different areas, which are all fantastic and worthy. If that's what you're determining it is, now does everything else in the storyline line up to that end? Otherwise, that won't be the end. And people look at it and go, that was a really confusing movie. Mm-hmm. I didn't connect this character with that character. And why did they have that scene in there? Because that had no role in where the story ended up closing itself out. Mm-hmm. Right. And so taking that construct and then applying that back just as this thought-provoking tool. So people are dealing with their mortality and how they think about the next generations and the mark that they're leaving during this very limited lifetime that we have that passes so quickly. Are you actually focused on the absolutely most important? And the tyranny of all of the small things,
small decisions,
don't get in the way of it.
Because in actuality, depending on your faith, on your worldview or faith lens, I believe our stories actually last far longer than just our arc on Earth. So into eternity and the afterlife. Right. So really, I'm looking at my life story as what really is just my blip on Earth story, and then it extends on into
And eternity. How does that your belief system then line up with your actions every day and doing that? As imperfectly as we all live, that's the striving for what that means beyond who we are and what we leave behind. But then you left behind California, right?
Yes.
After almost a decade there.
Yes.
You moved to Chicago and you went to the University of Chicago at that point.
Yes.
As a creative person, as an an individual that was in a very technical program. Talk a little bit about your experience there at Chicago, and then we'll move into the business side for you too.
Yeah, they say poets and quants so I got my MBA at University of Chicago, and language within MBA is poets and quants, kind of the qualitative or the quantitative. And I came from a creative design agency, so in LA, so you would certainly have likely classified me as a poet. But I went to University of Chicago, which is a quant jock school, or at least at the time, I believe they accepted me. So, but has a kind of trend of being in quant heavy. So I was certainly, Googling every single word that they were saying in the classes, because I came from the world of Photoshop and photo shoots, and all of a sudden I was in the world of Excel and with people who had been bankers for 10 years. So I didn't know the vernacular. Why did they let me in? I tested good. I'm good at standardized tests. So it was certainly a fish out of water, but it also gave me this perspective that led me to here, because what I find so fascinating is I think in the creative design world, we were sacrificing profitability potentially on the altar of a pretty picture on the day-to-day basis. And oftentimes, especially in business school, it can be flip-flopped, and you sacrifice qualitative aspects for the bottom line. You sacrifice beauty, you sacrifice art, you sacrifice the design on the altar of a penny of the bottom line on a day-to-day basis. And where I like to live is at the intersection of those two worlds, design and data, the qualitative and the quantitative, the mixture of that poet and poet and quant. So beautifully, Redmark allows me to do that. We look at the actual metrics behind things, but we also look at the qualitative aspects of how it connects to people. So we can kind of mesh the world of creative design movies and number crunching Excel spreadsheets into something that is what I believe accesses both sides of our brain, or more human on both sides.
Right. Was it during your time in school that you had the vision then for Redmark, or did you have the vision for Redmark and that's why you went to the University of Chicago to get the additional, skills and competencies to build into that? What was the chicken and the egg in that equation?
I knew I wanted to do an MBA, and at the time I thought I wanted to be on a founding team of a tech startup. It was really around when Netflix was taking off and things were going from DVDs to more technology streaming. So I thought that I wanted to be on a founding team of a technology startup, and an MBA would allow me to have a broader business sense to do so. And while I was at Booth, you're supposed to interview the whole time for jobs. And I wanted to be at a startup, and startups weren't hiring from MBAs. So I just went and offered my help to all the startups in Chicago 10 years ago. And what I found was I did love doing that, but I actually loved the process and helping each of these organizations communicate to their audience. So I was still in this movie mentality, and how are they communicating to the audience? So rather than be on the founding team of a startup, I started making some processes and utilizing the structure that we had used for films in helping these organizations structure how they talk to their audience and how they think through connecting with their audiences. So rather than be on the founding team of a tech startup, I started helping as a vendor for these organizations look at that process. How do we connect with our audiences? And then built some framework around that. And that was the origin. Once I graduated, I said, hey, I can't do this for free anymore. But here's what I would do next with you if you would like to. And some of them said no, some of them said yes, and some of them said not for that much. And that was about 10 years ago now. And the origination. So originally it was Tricia Felice Consulting, and I was a consultant doing this. And then we incorporated, I got some staff, and we started kind of moving through as a more formally over the past 10 years developed that. So it was a bit gradual in that.
So let's even talk about that journey, because Redmark now, right around now, you have your 10th anniversary.
Yeah.
Right. So
Graciously.
on that journey, how would you describe your 10-year journey from startup yourself to then experiencing the growth and even where you're at today? How do you break that down in your own storyline and learnings?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because how do I break it down? I think you got me stumped. Because I was just thinking what's coming up for me is, I because I get to work so closely with my clients, I end up going to sleep thinking about their audiences and how can we connect with their audiences, and don't reflect as much into my personal journey and who am I speaking to. But I would say that it's been centered around what are the needs of the organizations? What does that look like? And it's been really cool because we started working with tech startups mainly because that's who I knew from, or that's who I was working with originally. And through the past 10 years, I used to say, oh, well, no one's hiring me. They'd say it was more life cycle of the business on who we worked for. And I used to say, no one's hiring me. We do mostly consumer facing things. I mean, no one's hiring me for energy or healthcare. And I did a healthcare client. Turns out people in healthcare had just as much of an issue talking about what they do and why it's relevant and connecting with their audience. I had only worked for for-profit organizations. And in the past few years, God's opened up doors into nonprofit world because guess what? Nonprofit also can have challenges in how to communicate with their audience and how to explain what they do. So every time I try to classify, this is our, our audience, I'm finding it's because perhaps I've been naming it. People ask me, who do you work with? And they sort of want that demographic answer. We work with this type of company. And I should take my own advice. I should label my audience as a why-based personas, which is what I harped on before. Shame on me. And organizations so I'm continuously being allowed into organizations with different workings, different backbones, different frameworks, but finding the same challenges of connecting with their audience, growth through connecting with their audience, authentically, sustainably, and that crosses these kind of industries that we define. So that's been really exciting.
How would you describe then the ideal client persona, the ideal engagement persona for Redmark at this point?
So oftentimes it's really a broader lens of if you're looking for new audiences, how to communicate with your audiences, or how to explain. At one point, I wanted our tagline to be, we make your long story short, because you might not tell it because I might be long-winded here, but encapsulating, putting in a capsule what you do in an easily understandable manner. It's actually really hard to do when you know all the inner workings of it. But an audience, until they care about you, they're not going to read all your stuff. So I would say our who we have been able to help the most is individuals who are struggling to kind of convey what they're looking to get across to their audience. And we can use story theory and the story arc to do that. So that crosses industries. And it used to be a life cycle of, hey, if you're a startup that has proven out, maybe you've got a prototype and it works and you're at Series A and you're looking to expand your audience. You've got your early adopters, but now you need to talk to the mass market. That's what our goal was originally, because sort of like that movie I mentioned before, where it did great at the film festival, but now it's got to go into a theater. Maybe your startup did great with your early adopters, but now you got to talk to my mom. And my mom doesn't know. Sorry, Mom. But my mom might not even understand it in the same way. So helping them speak to new audiences that they might not know as well. But turns out that doesn't only happen at that stage. Speaking to new audiences happens maybe when you move into a new territory, maybe when you're looking at a new offering in your organization, and that might attract new users. So it doesn't just have to be that Series A growth standpoint. But when you're looking to how you're explaining what you're doing, how you're connecting, and what you're building for that audience.
So what would be your hope for the next decade of Redmark?
Oh, gracious.
As you look to the future, right? That continued building legacy, right? Put it in terms of strategic planning. Our team, our board, and our operating committee, we have another full day tomorrow offsite, coming together on these subjects to say, okay, what do we stop doing? Because it's those mini narratives, the mini themes, or the busy work. Make sure that we're focused on the most important in terms of what we want the organization to stand for and what that looks like into the future. And you have to be intentional about, well, what does that mean in an operating plan next year? What does that mean for the next few years? So you keep taking off all those things that encroach on what you're trying to build, that become distractions at times, and really focus on the items that deliver that most value of what you say your purpose is, right? And what you're striving to do. And that is just a lot of work, right? And it also becomes this difficult item to say, and here's what it is, and we'll know when we get there. And yes, you have to have all the financial planning and all the different functions represented and how you approach that. And yet you have to have that destination. Are we flying to New York? Are we flying to LA? Or where are we going with it? Where do you want to go, and where do you want to take Redmark?
Great question. I would say that utilizing story and connecting to audiences is strong enough to hold a 10-year view. I'm going to shorten the tactical to the next 5 years, only because so much is happening within AI, within how organizations are going to function, like from an operational role, that would be a whole nother time together that we could forecast out what that could look like for 10 years down the road. But within the next 3 to 5 years, I feel more solid in. Still, there'll be crazy things. Who knows what will come? But I would love us. I mentioned that we started working more with nonprofits in the past 3 years. So keeping a tech focus and a nonprofit focus, turns out the frameworks are relevant to both spaces. But oftentimes the actual builds, the deliverables, what's needed to communicate these stories is different when you pair with both. So we typically use some preferred vendors in areas that we don't have something to build in-house, but we've been hiring so internally and bringing some of that in-house, which has been really exciting time. So I would say to keep that pulse on tech, and which is in my mind oftentimes for-profit tech startups, and in a donor-based nonprofit space. And can we standardize internally both of those aspects? This is the challenge that we're rising to now, is can you standardize in-house both of those? It doesn't make sense to standardize in-house both of those processes and what it needs to deliver on both of those worlds. But I'm excited to kind of be able to see what the pulse is in both of those areas, because I do see trends moving to less of a distinction between for-profit and nonprofit organizations.
And why it's one of those items where it's called a pet peeve, call it what you will, is the distinction based on tax status. Because there's a lot of organizations out there that are nonprofits. They're saying, well, we don't do that because we're a nonprofit. It's like, why does your tax status have anything to do with how excellent you're running your organization, how you're thinking about how you're handling your staff and your team, how you're serving the people that you're serving? Your tax status really has nothing to do with that. So why do we talk about for-profit, non-for-profit? As you're out there telling your story, who are you serving, right? Are you the guide to the organization in order for them to be the hero in whatever the hell is they're doing, right?
Did you just link it back to demographic target groups and why-based target groups?
I tried to. I'm trying to be a good student here.
Even a for-profit and not-for-profit, how I'm describing those two sections of clients are probably demographic or are not why based descriptors. And that is meshing more and more today, where my guess is in 10 years, there'd be some, I don't know if that necessarily the tax, I'm not a tax person, but I don't know if the tax statuses would be different, but there's certainly more of a blurring in the lines today of what is not for profit, what is for profit, and why does it matter?
Right. And what is impact investing? Because frankly,
there you go.
You should be making an impact no matter what you're doing.
Yes.
And how you're approaching what it is. Right. And then the linking up of the whys together, where it's not one person's why going in one direction, another person's going in another, or their purpose and what they're striving for. How do you bring those individuals together to have a greater effect overall?
Yes.
I think that just becomes powerful. But you've not only done this in business and with Redmark and the people that you're serving, you shared a story even with your dad and his professional career, and even looking at this and going, you're never too young to embrace some of these thoughts, concepts, and apply them. You mind sharing a little bit about your dad? If he wouldn't mind you sharing a little bit about your...
Yeah. So my dad retired a few years ago. He was in HR and executive recruitment, and had a long legacy in one organization. And retiring, there's a whole nother conversation to be had about succession planning, about retirement, and what that does to your story or who you see yourself as. But my dad wanted to bring it down a bit. My dad wanted to continue working in a capacity after he retired. So right after I had incorporated my company, I thought, what a great opportunity to help Dad be a mini startup. So we formed him an executive recruitment firm. It's called Rainmakers Talent. And he does placements currently for a variety of for-profit and not-for-profit. We need to change this language. For-profit and not-for-profit, and looking to focus more on mission-based organizations and helping them find great leaders and what he would call rainmakers, people who make things happen. And so we set him up, what do you need to do this? How do you start this? Yeah. If you want a career after your career, what does that look like? So starting small, getting him a website, getting him a name, getting him some business cards, some client funnel and what that looks like. And we launched him into a business also.
His own business at this point in time, and,
yes.
and his work that he's got going.
Yes.
Which is it gets back to that journey, right? And how we want to continue to be purposeful in what we're doing. You talked about, we were created to create, and what we're building, and are we building into this storyline, this narrative that again is something that's adding value to the world, that people will be impacted by. A lot of individuals talk about all the person that you never knew, but all the people that came to the funeral. And it's not about having a number of people at a funeral, but just going, here's lives that have been marked, right? And every day are you approaching and trying to mark lives in a positive and constructive manner. That isn't, it's not withholding tough love, right? It's not holding constructive criticism. It's not, but it's how are you positively impacting the world around you in everything that you're doing? Because effectively, that's why an entrepreneur created a business to begin with. Back to, I'm solving a problem. I'm making a difference. I'm helping other people, because I'm not the hero, I'm the guide in order to empower others in their own story and their journey.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I do think it happens in many ways. I have to speak this out because we've been talking about it from a business standpoint, but I do believe that people can be entrepreneurial in all aspects. I started that detective agency because I saw my mom being entrepreneurial. She didn't have a company, but she started her own preschool for us when we were young, and she called it Tot Time, and she got people from the neighborhood to join Tot Time and made an entire awesome preschool. And that is entrepreneurial. Just because you're not a tax entity, does maybe an entrepreneurial studies professor would fight me on this, that only means tax entity. But I think we can be a bit broader and see all of these ways of creation into what feeds that ultimate legacy. It doesn't have to just be your company. It can be what you're creating along the way, and all the things that you're creating along the way, whether they're corporations or whether they're organizations for your kids.
Right. No, I think that's, the wisdom in that, right? And the encouragement to some people that are like, well, I'm not an entrepreneur, right? I work for a big corporation. It's like, but you should also be bringing your best self and your giftedness into making a difference, whatever that sphere of influence is. Right.
Yeah.
So consider yourself an organization of one as a sole proprietor of you, even if you're in an organization that's got a couple 100,000 employees around the world.
Yeah.
You can still be creative and change and make a difference if you've got that spirit and that mindset, and you're not just punching a time clock and, chugging through the day. And that's not a criticism on people that work hourly. It's really, even if you're working hourly, that you are bringing your best to affect change wherever that may be. I think that's that entrepreneurial mindset. If someone wanted to pick up a book or watch a TED Talk or anything on this subject, are there any resources or thoughts or ideas for someone to say, this is fantastic, and how would I learn a little bit more?
Well, you and I are now going to start another podcast that's only based on narrative storytelling. Just kidding, but we could.
We could.
I'm pitching you right now. I'd have to think about the best book for it. I certainly don't have a book out. But looking into story theory is pretty easy, and there's a lot, and applying that concept is easy. I'll have to think of a book, and if this is posted on your site, we could put it in the comments.
Okay, there we go.
Resourcefulness.
So a few other just rapid fire for people to get to know you at a personal level.
Okay.
So in Chicago, your favorite restaurant?
My favorite restaurant in Chicago is Sapori.
Okay,
Sapori Trattoria. Okay. Italian restaurant.
So I'm going to put that on my list because I have not been there.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll have to do that. Favorite destination to go to, or a destination you'd want to go to if you were to take a week vacation and leave your phone behind?
I was hoping to bring my mom to Budapest. She's Hungarian, so I would love to do that.
Yeah, so that's next on the list.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts about yourself, about Redmark, and just about this subject?
Well, this was certainly inspiring to me. I mentioned focusing on, how much are we looking at our own personal journey? I spend a lot of times looking at my clients and their audiences and what their story is. But I love the concept of linking that narrative arc into our legacy and into what a legacy looks like, and how you're crafting your life, or how you could begin to think about crafting your life into that arc for what the resolution looks like. That was encouraging and exciting for me to think about. And I've got a little bit of additional thinking to do now for my own.
Well, very good. Yeah. Very good. Like I said, I was so excited to come into this conversation. You've challenged me in the same way in the application and the thought process regarding the people that we are serving, people that we hope to serve in the future, that alignment, that fit, right? There's a chemistry there, because I think there's something that comes into play regarding that, the why and the purpose and where people are going towards, and playing that guide role, back with the families that we serve, and making sure that we continue to do that and stay true to our mission, and not drift from that. It's another great book, is Mission Drift by Peter Greer.
Yeah.
So really, that's the challenge, because all of the little things that creep in, I think that's the challenge for every entrepreneur, to say, step back, take out the things that are not meaningful, stay focused on that longer term picture, understand what that resolution, that legacy is desired to be, and are you building that every day? So thank you again, Tricia, for joining me today. And I look forward to I think we built an entirely new podcast and a couple other episodes out of this too.
We did. Okay.
So thank you so much.
Reconnect on those.
And for any of the listeners that want to continue the dialogue, please send us an email at clearconversations@ccpwealth.com. Thank you and have a blessed day.